Ayrton Senna knew Formula One was broken. He stood in front of race officials, other drivers, and team bosses and warned them. He didn't just talk about it in private. He demanded change. Publicly. Loudly. And when the sport refused to listen, he paid the ultimate price for trying to save it. This isn't just about a racing legend. This is about a man who saw disaster coming, tried to stop it, and became the reason Formula One finally woke up. Because what Senna fought for while he was alive only became reality after he was gone. Ayrton Senna wasn't just fast. He was the driver everyone listened to. When he walked into a room, conversation shifted. When he spoke at drivers' meetings, people stopped and paid attention. Not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he carried weight. He'd won 3 world championships. He'd mastered conditions other drivers feared. And more than that, he cared. Other drivers might complain privately, but Senna stood up in front of officials and said what needed to be said. He wasn't afraid to look like the difficult one. He wasn't worried about being liked by the people in charge. He saw himself as more than a competitor. He was a voice for drivers who didn't have his platform. Younger drivers. Quieter personalities. The ones who couldn't afford to push back. And that's exactly why what happened next matters so much. Because when someone like Senna raises the alarm, you should listen. But Formula One in the early 90s wasn't just dangerous. It was spiraling. And the sport had no idea how fast things were about to break. By the early 1990s, Formula One had become a runaway experiment. Cars were faster than ever before. Engines were more powerful. Aerodynamics were more complex. But here's the problem: the tracks hadn't changed. The barriers hadn't improved. The safety standards were still built for a slower era. Technical regulations kept shifting, and every change introduced new instability. Teams pushed the limits of what was physically possible, and drivers were expected to control machines that were becoming harder and harder to predict. The margin for error was shrinking. But the consequences of making a mistake, those stayed the same. And everyone in the paddock could feel it. This wasn't just fast. This was reckless. Formula One was evolving faster than its ability to protect the people inside the cars. And Senna? He was the only one willing to say it out loud. Ayrton Senna wasn't reacting to crashes. He was watching the trajectory of the sport and realizing where it was headed. He could feel it in the cars, the instability, the unpredictability, the lack of control at high speeds. He saw it in the tracks, barriers that weren't designed for modern impacts, runoff areas that were too short, medical responses that were too slow. He started speaking up. Not just casually. Not just in interviews. He raised concerns in official meetings. He pushed for changes to circuit design. He questioned why driver skill was expected to compensate for poor safety infrastructure. He made it clear, talent shouldn't be a substitute for survival. But the sport moved slowly. Too slowly. Because change costs money. Change disrupts schedules. Change admits something was wrong in the first place. And Formula One didn't want to admit that. So Senna kept racing. He kept pushing. And he kept warning them. But by the time that one weekend came, the atmosphere in the paddock had already shifted. There are weekends in sports that feel different before anything happens. The air is heavier. The mood is tense. People move differently. Talk differently. That's what the paddock felt like. There was an edge to everything. Senna wasn't his usual self either. He was serious. Focused. Not in the way a competitor gets locked in before a race, but in the way someone does when they know something is wrong and they can't fix it. He'd been vocal all season. He'd been pushing for change. And now, standing on the grid, he carried that weight with him. What happened that day isn't the point of this story. What matters is what came after. Because Senna's death didn't just shock the world. It shattered the illusion that Formula One had everything under control. And suddenly, every warning he'd given, every concern he'd raised, every change he'd demanded, all of it became impossible to ignore. When Ayrton Senna died, Formula One went silent. Not literally, but emotionally. The sport had lost drivers before. But this was different. This was a 3-time world champion. This was the voice that spoke for others. This was the man who'd been telling them, publicly and repeatedly, that something had to change. And now he was gone. Because of the very dangers he'd been warning about. The realization hit hard. All those conversations where officials nodded politely but did nothing. All those meetings where drivers raised concerns and were told the sport was working on it. All those moments when safety was treated as secondary to spectacle. It all came crashing down in one moment. Formula One had ignored its most credible voice. And that silence, that refusal to act, had cost them everything. But here's what's remarkable. What Senna couldn't achieve while he was alive happened almost immediately after his death. Within weeks, Formula One started changing. Not slowly. Not cautiously. Fast. Urgently. Like a sport that finally realized it had been playing with fire. Tracks were redesigned. Barriers were upgraded. Runoff areas were extended. Cars were required to meet new structural safety standards. Cockpit protection was reinforced. Medical response protocols were overhauled. The entire approach to driver safety was rebuilt from the ground up. Things that had been too expensive or too complicated suddenly became mandatory. Changes that had been delayed for years were implemented in months. And every single one of those reforms proved something Senna had been saying all along: the sport could be safer. It just chose not to be. His death forced accountability. It made the cost of inaction undeniable. And it turned his warnings into policy. Here's what makes Ayrton Senna's impact so powerful. Every modern Formula One driver owes their life to the changes that came after his death. The halo device that protects cockpits. The crash structures that absorb impacts. The medical advancements that treat injuries faster. The track designs that prioritize runoff zones over tight walls. All of it traces back to that moment when Formula One finally listened. Drivers walk away from crashes today that would have been fatal 30 years ago. They survive impacts at 200 miles per hour. They walk out of wrecked cars and wave to the crowd. And they're able to do that because someone stood up and demanded better. Because someone refused to stay quiet. Because Ayrton Senna cared more about protecting the next generation than preserving his own reputation. His voice is still shaping decisions. His influence is still saving lives. And his legacy isn't about what he won. It's about what he fought for. Ayrton Senna didn't just race for trophies. He raced for something bigger. He pushed Formula One to confront its own dangers. He spoke up when silence was easier. He demanded change when the sport refused to move. And in the end, his voice was finally heard. Not because people wanted to listen, but because they had no choice. He tried to save Formula One. And even though it cost him his life, he succeeded.